Chapter 41 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2. This is LibriVox Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Thomas Kooz. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2, Paris and Prison, by Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur MACHEN. Episode 10, Under the Leads, Chapter 32, Part 1. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Monsieur de Bouillon, the Comptroller, Monsieur le Duc de Choiseul, Monsieur Paris du Vernet, establishment of the lottery, my brother's arrival at Paris, his reception by the Academy. Once more, then, I was in Paris, which I ought to regard as my fatherland, since I could return no more to that land which gave me birth, an unworthy country, yet, in spite of all, ever dear to me, possibly on account of early impressions and early prejudices, or possibly because the beauties of Venice are really unmatched in the world. But mighty Paris is a place of good luck or ill, as one takes it, and it is my part to catch the favouring gale. Paris was not wholly new to me. As my readers know, I had spent 2 years there, but I must confess that, having then no other aim than to pass the time pleasantly, I had merely devoted myself to pleasure and enjoyment. Fortune, to whom I had paid no court, had not opened to me her golden doors, but I now felt that I must treat her more reverently, and attach myself to the throng of her favoured sons, whom she loads with her gifts. I understood now that the nearer one draws to the sun, the more one feels the warmth of its rays. I saw that to attain my end I should have to employ all my mental and physical talents, that I must make friends of the great, and take cue from all whom I found it to be my interest to please. To follow the plan suggested by these thoughts, I saw that I must avoid what is called bad company, that I must give up my old habits and pretensions, which would be sure to make me enemies, who would have no scruple in representing me as a trifler, and not fit to be trusted with affairs of any importance. I think I thought wisely, and the reader, I hope, will be of the same opinion. I will be reversed, said I, in what I say and what I do, and thus I shall get a reputation for discretion, which will bring its reward. I was in no anxiety on the score of present needs, as I could reckon on a monthly allowance of 100 crowns, which my adopted father, the good and generous Monsieur de Bragadin, sent me, and I found this sum sufficient in the meanwhile, for with a little self-restraint one can live cheaply at Paris, and cut a good figure at the same time. I was obliged to wear a good suit of clothes, and to have a decent lodging, for in all large towns the most important thing is outward show, by which at the beginning one is always judged. My anxiety was only for the pressing needs for the moment, for, to speak the truth, I had neither clothes nor linen, in a word, nothing. If my relations with the French ambassador are recalled, it will be found natural that my first idea was to address myself to him, as I knew him sufficiently well to reckon on his serving me. Being perfectly certain that the porter would tell me that my lord was engaged, I took care to have a letter, and in the morning I went to the Palais Bourbon. The porter took my letter, and I gave him my address and returned home. Wherever I went I had to tell the story of my escape from the Leads. This became a service almost as tiring as the flight itself had been, as it took me 2 hours to tell my tale, without the slightest bit of fancy work, but I had to be polite to the curious inquirers, and to pretend that I believed them moved by the most affectionate interest in my welfare. In general, the best way to please is to take the benevolence of all with whom one has relation for granted. I supped at Sylvia's, and as the evening was quieter than the night before, I had time to congratulate myself on all the friendship she showed me. The girl was, as I had said, 15 years old, and I was in every way charmed with her. I complimented the mother on the good results of her education, and I did not even think of guarding myself from falling victim to her charms. I had taken so lately such well-founded and philosophical resolutions, and I was not yet sufficiently at my ease to value the pain of being tempted. I left at an early hour, impatient to see what kind of an answer the minister had sent me. I had not long to wait, and I received a short letter appointing a meeting for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It may be guessed that I was punctual, and my reception by His Excellence was most flattering. Monsieur de Bernis expressed his pleasure at seeing me after my fortunate escape, and at being able to be of service to me. He told me that M. had informed him of my escape, and he had flattered himself that the first person I should go see in Paris would be himself. He showed me the letters from M. relating to my arrest and escape, but all the details in the latter were purely imaginary and had no foundation in fact. M. was not to blame, as she could only write what she had heard, and it was not easy for anyone besides myself to know the real circumstances of my escape. The charming nun said that, no longer buoyed up by the hope of seeing either of the men who alone had made her in love with life, her existence had become a burden to her, and she was unfortunate in not being able to take any comfort in religion. C. often comes to see me, she said, but I grieve to say she is not happy with her husband. I told Monsieur de Bernis that the account of my flight from the Leads, as told by our friend, was wholly inaccurate, and I would therefore take the liberty of writing out the whole story with the minutest details. He challenged me to keep my word, assuring me that he would send a copy to M., and at the same time, with the utmost courtesy, he put a packet of 100 louis in my hand, telling me that he would think what he could do for me, and would advise me as soon as he had any communication to make. Thus furnished with ample funds, my first care was for my dress, and this done I went to work, and in a week sent my generous protector the result, giving him permission to have as many copies printed as he liked, and to make any use he pleased of it to interest in my behalf such persons as might be of service to me. 3 weeks after, the minister summoned me to say that he had spoken of me to Monsieur Erizzo, the Venetian ambassador, who had nothing to say against me, but for fear of embroiling himself with the state inquisitors declined to receive me. Not wanting anything from him, his refusal did me no harm. Monsieur de Bernis then told me that he had given a copy of my history to Madame la Marquise de Pompadour, and he promised to take the first opportunity of presenting me to this all-powerful lady. You can present yourself, my dear Casanova, added His Excellence, to the Duc de Choiseul and Monsieur de Boulogne, the Comptroller. You will be well received, and with a little wit you ought to be able to make good use of the letter. He himself will give you the cue, and you will see that he who listens obtains. Try to invent some useful plan for the royal exchequer. Don't let it be complicated or chimerical, and if you don't write it out at too great length, I will give you my opinion on it. I left the minister in a pleased and grateful mood, but extremely puzzled to find a way of increasing the royal revenue. I knew nothing of finance, and after racking my brains, all that I could think of was new methods of taxation, but all my plans were either absurd or certain to be unpopular, and I rejected them all on consideration. As soon as I found out that Monsieur de Choiseul was in Paris, I called on him. He received me in his dressing-room, where he was writing while his valet did his hair. He stretched his politeness so far as to interrupt himself several times to ask me questions, but as soon as I began to reply, his Grace began to write again, and I suspect did not hear what I was saying, though now and again he seemed to be looking at me. It was plain that his eyes and his thoughts were occupied on different objects. In spite of this way of receiving visitors, or me, at all events, Monsieur de Choiseul was a man of wit. When he had finished writing, he said in Italian that Monsieur de Bernis had told him of some circumstances of my escape, and he added, "Tell me how you succeeded. My lord, it would be too long a story. It would take me at least 2 hours, and your Grace seems busy. Tell me briefly about it. However much I speak to the point, I shall take 2 hours. You can keep the details for another time. The story is devoid of interest without the details. Well, well, you can tell me the whole story in brief without losing much of the interest. Very good. After that I can say no more. I must tell your lordship, then, that the state inquisitors shut me up under the Leads, that after 15 months and 5 days of imprisonment I succeeded in piercing the roof, that after many difficulties I reached the chancery by a window, and broke open the door. Afterwards I got to St. Mark's Place, whence, taking a gondola which bore me to the mainland, I arrived at Paris, and have had the honour to pay my duty to your lordship. But what are the Leads? My lord, I should take a quarter of an hour at least to explain. How did you pierce the roof? I could not tell your lordship in less than half an hour. Why were you shut up? It would be a long tale, my lord. I think you are right. The interest of the story lies chiefly in the details. I took the liberty of saying as much to your grace. Well, I must go to Versailles, but I shall be delighted if you will come and see me sometimes. In the meanwhile, Monsieur Casanova, think what I can do for you. I had been most offended at the way in which Monsieur de Choiseul had received me, and I was inclined to resent it. But the end of our conversation, and above all the kindly tone of his last words, quieted me, and I left him, if not satisfied, at least without bitterness in my heart. From him I went to Monsieur de Boulogne's, and found him a man of quite a different stamp to the Duke, in manners, dress, and appearance. He received me with great politeness, and began by complimenting me on the high place I enjoyed in the opinion of Monsieur de Bernis, and on my skill in matters of finance. I felt that no compliment had been so ill deserved, and I could hardly help bursting into laughter. My good angel, however, made me keep my countenance. Monsieur de Boulogne had an old man with him. Every feature bore the imprint of genius, and who inspired me with respect. "Give me your views," said the comptroller, "either on paper or viva voce. You will find me willing to learn and ready to grasp your ideas. Here is Monsieur Paris de Verneuil, who wants 20 millions for his military school, and he wishes to get this sum without a charge on the state or emptying the treasury. It is God alone, sir, who has the creative power." "I am not a god," said Monsieur de Verneuil, "but for all that I have now and then created, but the times have changed." "Everything," I said, "is more difficult than it used to be, but in spite of difficulties, I have a plan which would give the king the interest of 100 millions. What expense would there be to the crown? Merely the cost of receiving. The nation, then, would furnish the sum in question? Undoubtedly, but voluntarily. I know what you are thinking of. You astonish me, sir, as I have told nobody of my plan. If you have no other engagement, do me the honour of dining with me tomorrow, and I will tell you what your project is. It is a good one, but surrounded, I believe, with insuperable difficulties. Nevertheless, we will talk it over and see what can be done. Will you come? I will do myself that honour." "Very good. I will expect you at Plaisance." After he had gone, Monsieur de Boulogne praised his talents and honesty. He was the brother of Monsieur de Montmartel, whom secret history makes the father of Madame de Pompadour, for he was the lover of Madame Poisson at the same time as Monsieur le Normand. I left the comptroller's and went to walk in the Tuileries, thinking over the strange stroke of luck which had happened to me. I had been told that 20 millions were wanted, and I had boasted of being able to get 100, without the slightest idea of how it was to be done. And on that a well-known man, experienced in the public business, had asked me to dinner to convince me that he knew what my scheme was. There was something odd and comic about the whole affair, but that corresponded very well with my modes of thought and action. "If he thinks he is going to pump me," said I, "he will find himself mistaken. When he tells me what the plan is, it will rest with me to say he has guessed it or he is wrong, as the inspiration of the moment suggests. If the question lies within my comprehension, I may perhaps be able to suggest something new, and if I understand nothing, I will wrap myself up in a mysterious silence, which sometimes produces a good effect. At all events, I will not repulse fortune, when she appears to be favourable to me. Monsieur de Bernis had only told Monsieur de Boulogne that I was a financier to get me a hearing, as otherwise he might have declined to see me. I was sorry not to be master, at least, of the jargon of the business, as in that way men have got out of a similar difficulty, and by knowing the technical terms, and nothing more, have made their mark. No matter, I was bound to the engagement. I must put a good face on a bad game, and, if necessary, pay with the currency of assurance. The next morning I took a carriage, and in a pensive mood I told the coachman to take me to Monsieur de Vernay's at Plaisance, a place a little beyond Vincennes. I was set down at the door of the famous man who, 40 years ago, had rescued France on the brink of the precipice down which law had almost precipitated her. I went in and saw a great fire burning on the hearth, which was surrounded by 7 or 8 persons, to whom I was introduced as a friend of the Minister for Foreign Affairs and of the Comptroller. Afterwards he introduced these gentlemen to me, giving to each his proper title, and I noted that 4 of them were Treasury officials. After making my bow to each, I gave myself over to the worships of Harpocrates, and without too great an air of listening, was all ears and eyes. The conversation at first was of no special interest, as they were talking of the Seine being frozen over, and the ice being a foot thick. Then came the recent death of Monsieur de Fontenelle, then the case of Damien, who would confess nothing, and of the 5 millions his trial would cost the crown. The coming to war they praised Monsieur de Soubise, who had been chosen by the king to command the army. Hence the transition was easy to the expenses of the war, and how they were to be defrayed. I listened and was weary, for all they said was so full of technicalities that I could not follow the meaning. And if silence can ever be imposing, my determined silence of an hour and a half's duration ought to have made me seem a very important personage in the eyes of these gentlemen. At last, just as I was beginning to yawn, dinner was announced, and I was another hour and a half without opening my mouth, except to do honour to an excellent repast. Directly the dessert had been served, Monsieur de Vernay asked me to follow him into a neighbouring apartment, and to leave the other guests at the table. I followed him, and we crossed a hall where we found a man of good aspect, about 50 years old, who followed us into a closet, and was introduced to me by Monsieur de Vernay under the name of Calsobigi. Directly after, 2 superintendents of the Treasury came in, and Monsieur de Vernay smilingly gave me a folio book, saying, "That, I think, Monsieur Casanova, is your plan." I took the book and read. Lottery consisting of 90 tickets to be drawn every month, only 1 in 18 to be a winning number. I gave him back the book and said, with the utmost calmness, "I confess, sir, that is exactly my idea." "You have anticipated, then?" "The project is by Monsieur de Calsobigi here." "I'm delighted not at being anticipated, but to find that we think alike. But may I ask you why you have not carried out the plan?" "Several very plausible reasons have been given against it, which have had no decisive answers." "I can only conceive one reason against it," said I coolly. "Perhaps the king would not allow his subjects to gamble." "Never mind that. The king will let his subjects gamble as much as they like. The question is, will they gamble? I wonder how anyone can have any doubt on that score, as the winners are certain of being paid. Let us grant, then, that they will gamble. How is the money to be found? How is the money to be found? The simplest thing in the world. All you want is a decree in council authorizing you to draw on the treasury. All I want is for the nation to believe that the king can afford to pay 100 millions. 100 millions! Yes, 100 millions, sir. We must dazzle people. But if France is to believe that the crown can afford to pay 100 millions, it must believe that the crown can afford to lose 100 millions, and who is going to believe that? Do you? To be sure I do, for the crown, before it could lose 100 millions, would have received at least 150 millions, and so there need to be no anxiety on that score. I am not the only person who has doubts on the subject. You must grant the possibility of the crown losing an enormous sum at the first drawing. Certainly, sir, but between possibility and reality is all the region of the infinite. Indeed, I may say that it would be a great piece of good fortune if the crown were to lose largely on the first drawing. A piece of bad fortune, you mean, surely? A bad fortune is to be desired. You know that all the insurance companies are rich. I will undertake to prove before all the mathematicians in Europe that the king is bound to gain 1 in 5 in this lottery. That is the secret. You will confess that the reason ought to yield to mathematical proof? Yes, of course. But how is it that the Castelletto cannot guarantee the crown a certain gain? Neither the Castelletto nor anyone in the world can guarantee absolutely that the king shall always win. What guarantees us against any suspicion of sharp practice is the drawing once a month, as then the public is sure that the holder of the lottery may lose. Will you be good enough to express your sentiments on the subject before the council? I will do so with much pleasure. You will arrange all objections? I think I can promise as much. Will you give me your plan? Not before it is accepted, and I am guaranteed a reasonable profit. But your plan may possibly be the same as the one before us. I think not. I see Monsieur de Calsabigi for the first time, and as he has not shown me his scheme, and I have not communicated mine to him, it is improbable, not to say impossible, that we should agree in all respects. Besides, in my plan I clearly show how much profit the crown ought to get per annum. It might therefore be formed by a company who would pay the crown a fixed sum? I think not. Why? For this reason. The only thing which would make the lottery pay would be an irresistible current of public opinion in its favor. I should not care to have anything to do with it in the service of a company who, thinking to increase their profits, might extend their operations, a course which would entail certain loss. I don't see how. In 1,000 ways, which I will explain to you another time, and which I am sure you can guess for yourself. In short, if I am to have any voice in the matter, it must be a government lottery or nothing. Monsieur de Casalbini thinks so too. I am delighted to hear it, but not at all surprised, for, thinking on the same lines, we are bound to arrive at the same results. Have you anybody ready for the Castelletto? I shall only want intelligent machines, for whom there are plenty in France. I went out for a moment, and found them in groups on my return, discussing my project with great earnestness. Monsieur Casalbigi, after asking me a few questions, took my hand, which he shook heartily, saying he should like to have some further conversation with me, and, returning the friendly pressure, I told him that I should esteem it as an honour to be numbered amongst his friends. Thereupon I left my address with Monsieur du Vernai, and took my leave, satisfied, by my inspection of the faces before me, that they all had a high opinion of my talents. End of chapter 41. Recording by John Thomas Kooz. www.johnkooz.com. Chapter 42 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2. This is LibriVox Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Thomas Kooz Kuzmarski. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2, Paris and Prison, by Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur Machen. Episode 10, Chapter 32, Part 2. 3 days after Monsieur de Calsabigi called on me, and after receiving him in my best style, I said that if I had not called on him, it was only because I did not wish to be troublesome. He told me that my decisive ways of speaking had made a great impression, and was certain that if I cared to make interest with the comptroller, we would set up the lottery and make a large profit.
I think so too, said I, but the financiers will make a much larger profit, and yet they do not seem anxious about it. They have not communicated with me, but it is their look-out, as I shall not make it my chief aim. You will undoubtedly hear something about it today, for I know for a fact that Monsieur de Boulogne has spoken of you to Monsieur de Courtel. Very good, but I assure you I did not ask him to do so. After some further conversation, he asked me, in the most friendly manner possible, to come and dine with him, and I accepted his invitation with a great pleasure, and just as we were starting, I received a note from Monsieur de Bernis, in which he said that if I could come to Versailles the next day, he would present me to Madame de Pompadour, and that I should have an opportunity of seeing Monsieur de Boulogne. In high glee at this happy chance, less from vanity than policy, I made Monsieur de Calsabigi read the letter, and I was pleased to see him opening his eyes as he read it. You can force Duvernay himself to accept the lottery, he said, and your fortune is made if you are not too rich already to care about such matters. Nobody is ever rich enough to despise good fortune, especially when it is not due to favor. Very true. We have been doing our utmost for 2 years to get the plan accepted, and have met with nothing beyond foolish objections, which you have crushed to pieces. Nevertheless, our plans must be very similar. Believe me, it will be best for us to work in concert, for by yourself you would find insuperable difficulties in the working, and you will find no intelligent machines in Paris. My brother will do all the work, and you will be able to reap the advantages at your ease. Are you, then, not the inventor of the scheme which has been shown me? No, it is the work of my brother. Shall I have the pleasure of seeing him? Certainly. His body is feeble, but his mind is in all its vigor. We shall see him directly. The brother was not a man of a very pleasing appearance, as he was covered with a kind of leprosy, but that did not prevent him from having a good appetite, writing, and enjoying all his bodily and intellectual faculties. He talked well and amusingly. He never went into society, as, besides his personal disfigurement, he was tormented with an irresistible and frequent desire of scratching himself, now in one place and now in another. And as all scratching is accounted an abominable thing in Paris, he preferred to be able to use his fingernails to the pleasures of society. He was pleased to say that, believing in God and his works, he was persuaded his nails had been given him to procure the only solace he was capable of in the kind of fury with which he was tormented. You are a believer, then, in final causes? I think you are right. But still I believe you would have scratched yourself if God had forgotten to give you any nails. My remarks made him laugh, and he then began to speak of our common business, and I soon found him to be a man of intellect. He was the elder of the 2 brothers, and a bachelor. He was expert in all kinds of calculations, an accomplished financier, with a universal knowledge of commerce, a good historian, a wit, a poet, and a man of gallantry. His birthplace was Leghorn. He had been in a government office at Naples, and had come to Paris with Monsieur de l'Hôpital. His brother was also a man of learning and talent, but in every respect his inferior. He showed me the pile of papers on which he had worked out all the problems referring to the lottery. "If you think you can do without me," said he, "I must compliment you on your abilities. But I think you will find yourself mistaken. For if you have no practical knowledge of the matter, and no business men to help you, your theories will not carry you far. What will you do after you have obtained the decree? When you speak before the council, if you take my advice, you will fix a date after which you are not to be held responsible, that is to say, after which you will have nothing more to do with it. Unless you do so, you will be certain to encounter trifling and procrastination, which will defer your plan to the Greek Kalends. On the other hand, I can assure you that Monsieur de Verneuil would be very glad to see us join hands. Very much inclined to take these gentlemen into partnership, for the good reason that I could not do without them, but taking care that they should suspect nothing, I went down with the younger brother, who introduced me to his wife before dinner. I found present an old lady well known at Paris under the name of General La Mothe, famous for her former beauty and her gout, another lady, somewhat advanced in years, who was called Baroness Blanche, and was still the mistress of Monsieur de Vaux, another styled the President's lady, and a fourth, fair as the dawn, Madame Rossetti, from Piedmont, the wife of one of the violin players at the opera, and said to be courted by Monsieur de Fondpertuis, the superintendent of the opera. We sat down to dinner, but I was silent and absorbed, all my thoughts being monopolized by the lottery. In the evening, at Sylvia's, I was pronounced absent and pensive, and so I was in spite of the sentiment with which Mademoiselle Baletti inspired me, a sentiment with which every day grew in strength. I set out for Versailles next morning, 2 hours before daybreak, and was welcomed by Monsieur de Bernis, who said he would bet that but for him I should never have discovered my talent for finance. Monsieur de Boulogne tells me you astonished Monsieur du Vernai, who is generally esteemed one of the acutest men in France. If you will take my advice, Casanova, you will keep up that acquaintance and pay him assiduous court. I may tell you that the lottery is certain to be established, that it will be your doing, and that you ought to make something considerable out of it. As soon as the king goes out to hunt, be at hand in the private apartments, and I will seize a favourable moment for introducing you to the famous marquise. Afterwards, go to the office for foreign affairs, and introduce yourself in my name to the Abbé de la Ville. He is the chief official there, and will give you a good reception. Monsieur de Boulogne told me that, as soon as the council of the military school had given their consent, he would have the decree for the establishment of the lottery published, and he urged me to communicate to him any ideas which I might have on the subject of finance. At noon, Madame de Pompadour passed through the private apartments with the Prince de Soubise, and my patron hastened to point me out to the illustrious lady. She made me a graceful curtsy, and told me that she had been much interested in the subject of my flight. "Do you go," said she, "to see your ambassador?" "I show my respect to him, madame, by keeping away." "I hope you mean to settle in France." "It would be my dearest wish to do so, madame, but I stand in need of patronage, and I know that in France patronage is only given to men of talent, which is for me a discouraging circumstance. On the contrary, I think you have reason to be hopeful, as you have some good friends. I myself shall be delighted if I can be of any assistance to you." As the fair marquise moved on, I could only stammer forth my gratitude. I next went to the Abbé de la Ville, who received me with the utmost courtesy, and told me that he would remember me at the earliest opportunity. Versailles was a beautiful spot, but I had only compliments and not invitations to expect there. So after leaving Monsieur de la Ville, I went to an inn to get some dinner. As I was sitting down, an abbé of excellent appearance, just like dozens of other French abbés, accosted me politely, and asked me if I objected to our dining together. I always thought the company of a pleasant man a thing to be desired, so I granted his request, and as soon as he sat down he complimented me on the distinguished manner in which I had been treated by Monsieur de la Ville. "I was there writing a letter," said he, "and I could hear all the obliging things the abbé said to you. May I ask, sir, how you obtained access to him? If you really wish to know, I may be able to tell you. It is pure curiosity on my part. Well, then, I will say nothing from pure prudence." "I beg your pardon." "Certainly, with pleasure." Having thus shut the mouth of the curious impertinent, he confined his conversation to ordinary and more agreeable topics. After dinner, having no further business at Versailles, I made preparations for leaving, on which the abbe begged to be of my company. Although a man who frequents the society of abbes is not thought much more of than one who frequents the society of girls, I told him that as I was going to Paris in a public conveyance, far from its being a question of permission, I should be only too happy to have the pleasure of his company. On reaching Paris, we parted, after promising to call on each other, and I went to Sylvia's and took supper there. The agreeable mistress of the house complimented me on my noble acquaintances, and made me promise to cultivate their society. As soon as I got back to my own lodging, I found a note from Monsieur du Vernai, who requested me to come to the military school at 11 o'clock on the next day, and later, in the evening, Calsabigi came to me from his brother, with a large sheet of paper containing all the calculations pertaining to the lottery. Fortune seemed to be in my favour, for this tabular statement came to me like a blessing from on high. Resolving, therefore, to follow the instructions which I pretended to receive indifferently, I went to the military school, and as soon as I arrived the conference began. Monsieur d'Alembert had been requested to be present as an expert in arithmetical calculations. If Monsieur du Vernai had been the only person to be consulted, this step would not have been necessary, but the council contained some obstinate heads who were unwilling to give in. The conference lasted 3 hours. After my speech, which only lasted half an hour, Monsieur de Courtelly summed up my arguments, and an hour was passing in stating objections, which I refuted with the greatest of ease. I finally told them that no man of honour and learning would volunteer to conduct the lottery on the understanding that it was to win every time, and that if anyone had the impudence to give such an undertaking, they should turn him out of the room forthwith, for it was impossible that such an argument could be maintained except by some roguery. This had its effect, for nobody replied, and Monsieur du Vernai remarked that if the worst came to the worst, the lottery could be suppressed. At this I knew my business was done, and all present, after signing a document which Monsieur du Vernai gave them, took their leave, and I myself left directly afterwards with a friendly leave-taking from Monsieur du Vernai. Monsieur Calsabigi came to see me the next day, bringing the agreeable news that the affair was settled, and that all that was wanting was the publication of the decree. "I am delighted to hear it," I said, "and I will go to Monsieur de Boulon's every day, and get you appointed chief administrator as soon as I know what I have got for myself." I took care not to leave a stone unturned in this direction, as I knew that, with the great promising and keeping a promise are two different things. The decree appeared a week later. Calsabigi was made superintendent, with an allowance of 3,000 francs for every drawing, a yearly pension of 4,000 francs for us both, and the chief of the lottery. His share was a much larger one than mine, but I was not jealous, as I knew he had a greater claim than I. I sold 5 of the 6 offices that had been allotted to me for 2,000 francs each, and opened the 6th with great style in the Rue Saint-Denis, putting my valet there as a clerk. He was a bright young Italian, who had been valet to the Prince de la Cattolica, the ambassador from Naples. The day for the first drawing was fixed, and notice was given that the winning numbers would be paid in a week from the time of drawing at the chief office. With the idea of drawing custom to my office, I gave notice that all winning tickets bearing my signature would be paid at my office in 24 hours after the drawing. This drew crowds to my office and considerably increased my profits, as I had 6% on the receipts. A number of the clerks in the other offices were foolish enough to complain to Calsabigi that I had spoilt their gains, but he sent them about their business, telling them that to get the better of me they had only to do as I did, if they had the money. My first taking amounted to 40,000 francs. An hour after the drawing, my clerk brought me the numbers, and showed me that we had from 17 to 18,000 francs to pay, for which I gave him the necessary funds. Without my thinking of it, I thus made the fortune of my clerk, for every winner gave him something, and all this I let him keep for himself. The total receipts amounted to 2 millions, and the administration made a profit of 600,000 francs, of which Paris alone had contributed 1,000 francs. This was well enough for a first attempt. On the day after the drawing, I dined with Calsabigi at Monsieur du Vernay's, and I had the pleasure of hearing him complain that he had made too much money. Paris had 18 or 20 taverns, and although they were small, they increased the reputation of the lottery, and it was easy to see that the receipts at the next drawing would be doubled. The mock assaults that were made upon me put me in a good humour, and Calsabigi said that my idea had ensured me an income of 100,000 francs a year, though it would ruin the other receivers. I had played similar strokes myself, said Monsieur du Vernay, and have mostly succeeded, and as for the other receivers, they are at perfect liberty to follow Monsieur Casanova's example, and it all tends to increase the repute of an institution which we owe to him and to you. At the second drawing, a turn of 40,000 francs obliged me to borrow money. My receipts amounted to 60,000, but being obliged to deliver over my chest on the evening before the drawing, I had to pay out of my own funds, and was not repaid for a week. In all the great houses I went to, and at the theatres, as soon as I was seen, everybody gave me money, asking me to lay it out as I liked, and to send them the tickets, as so far the lottery was strange to most people. I thus got into the way of carrying about me tickets of all sorts, or rather of all prices, which I gave to people to choose from, going home in the evening with my pockets full of gold. This was an immense advantage to me, as kind of privilege which I enjoyed to the exclusion of the other receivers who were not in society, and did not drive a carriage like myself. No small point in one's favour, in a large town where men are judged by the state they keep. I found I was thus able to go into any society, and to get credit anywhere. I had hardly been a month in Paris, when my brother Francis, with whom I had parted in 1752, arrived from Dresden with Madame Silvestre. He had been in Dresden for 4 years, taking up with the pursuit of his art, having copied all the battle pieces in the Elector's galley. We were both of us glad to meet once more, but on my offering to see what my great friends could do for him with the academicians, he replied with all an artist's pride that he was much obliged to me, but would rather not have any other patrons than his talents. The French, said he, have rejected me once, and I am far from bearing them ill will on that account, for I would reject myself now if I were what I was then, but with their love of genius I reckon on a better reception this time. His confidence pleased me, and I complimented him upon it, for I have always been of the opinion that true merit begins by doing justice to itself. Francis painted a fine picture, which on being exhibited at the Louvre was received with applause. The Academy bought the picture for 12,000 francs. My brother became famous, and in 26 years he made almost 1,000,000 of money. But in spite of that foolish expenditure, his luxurious style of living and 2 bad marriages were the ruin of him. End of chapter 32. End of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 2, Paris and Prison, by Giacomo Casanova, translated by Arthur Machen. Recording by John Thomas Kooz Kosmarski. John Thomas Kooz. www.validateyourlife.com